Hey boys, it's HarmNone. Today, we're going to be ranking all of the Benefactor vehicles in Grand Theft Auto Online in tier list form. Now, Benefactor is my favorite brand in Grand Theft Auto 5, and they have a lot of really good cars to choose from. At least, most of the cars are really good to choose from. Now, if you haven't seen one of my tier list or ranking videos before, there is something that you must know. This list is 100% factual and cannot be argued with. If you want to try to argue, you can see what might happen. Without further ado, we're going to get started with F tier. Now, I do like Benefactor, but that does not mean that I like every single Benefactor. This is an example of one of the cars that I do not like. This is, of course, the Benefactor Shafter. This thing goes for $65,000 on Southern San Andreas Super Autos, or of course you can steal it right off of the street. If for some reason you do want this thing, that is how I would recommend getting it. The Shafter is really just not remarkable in any way. It has some good customization, which I will give it. Other than that though, the performance is pretty forgettable. This car is really not that good. Doesn't handle well, doesn't accelerate well. It's better suited as a submarine, but it's not submersible, so. And with that being said, we are done with F tier. Next up, to start off C tier, we have the Benefactor Serrano. Now, this is not to be confused with the Benefactor Serrano. There are two of these, but they're spelled slightly differently, but they're pronounced about the same. Now, the Serrano is a really cool SUV, and it's one that's pretty underrated, I feel like. It actually has some customization options like the wing that you can see on the top here. The exhaust is also customizable, as well as the front grille. Now, on top of all of that, it actually has pretty decent performance, I must say. For an SUV that costs $60,000, this thing is pretty darn good. Now, are you going to win any races with it? No, absolutely not. For free mode, and as a car that is very cheap, it's very good for what it is. That's pretty much it for the Benefactor Serrano. Let's move on to the next vehicle in C tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Streeter. This car is, well, weird. It costs $500,000 and it is, well, essentially a Mercedes station wagon with a lift kit and made to go off-road, which is odd. Now, it does have a little bit of customization that you can do to it, albeit it's not very much, but I do think that it is a pretty good looking car. Honestly, if they made this thing without the lift kit, I think it'd be a very cool vehicle. Now, that's not to say that I don't think that the Streeter is a cool vehicle, but for $500,000, the performance is not exactly fantastic. However, it's not terrible either. I must say, I actually do kind of like this thing. Its handling is very odd. You would expect it to not handle very well at all, but it actually does have pretty decent handling. If it had a spoiler option, I'm sure it would be much better, but unfortunately, it doesn't. For $500K, the Streeter is okay. It's in C tier because, well, I really just didn't know where to place this thing. It doesn't really have a home in any tier. I didn't feel like it was worthy of being an F tier vehicle, but I didn't feel like it was much better than C tier. With that being said, let's move on to the next vehicle in C tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Shafter Lwb. Now, this thing is much better than the regular Shafter. A large part of that is, well, it actually has some customization and it's just a better vehicle overall. The performance of this vehicle is largely better than the regular Shafter, although it does come at a cost. This thing is $208,000, and for that price, you do get a pretty decent performing sedan, albeit it's not the best. Now, the exhaust sound on this car is really good. Like I said, it has a little bit of customization as well. The handling is actually very good on this vehicle in comparison to the Shafter V12, which is the Shafter LWB's faster sort of brother, I guess. Overall, the LWB is a good car, but it doesn't have the performance that the Shafter V12 has overall, at least in terms of top speed and acceleration. Let's move on to the next vehicle. Next up, we have the Shafter Lwb Armored. Now, the armored version of the LWB does come at a cost, which is $438,000 as opposed to $208,000 for the regular LWB. Now, what you get for your extra double your money, plus a little bit more, the ability to take one RPG and still drive. That's right, this thing is armored and it does have bullet resistant windows as well, of course. Now, the bullet resistant windows can take up to 15 shots from an assault rifle, I believe somewhere around 6 shots from a heavy sniper, 15 pistol shots, and I'm not sure how many from a minigun, but it's not very many. Like I said, it can also take one RPG and the car will still function, although it will be smoking and it will be slightly damaged. and if you get hit with another RPG, the car is done for. So basically, for paying a little bit more than double for the cost of the LWB, you do get the ability to survive one RPG and protect your character inside a little bit better. Now, don't get me wrong, the LWB is a great car. I really do like this thing. However, for the extra cost, it's really not super worth it. Yes, it's a little bit armored. Yes, that can be useful. But for the most part, it's not going to come in handy very often in GTA, especially these days when people are riding around on Oppressor Mark IIs. Still, great car, just not that great. This is of course the last vehicle in C tier, so with that being said, let's move on to B tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Dubsta to start off B tier. Now, I couldn't put this thing in C tier because it's just too cool, but I couldn't put it any higher in B tier because its performance is just not that great. Now, the Benefactor Dubsta is actually a very customizable SUV in Grand Theft Auto Online. It's got some really cool features. Pretty much everything that you see on this thing that looks like a modification, well, it is a modification. And you could even go crazier than I have with the customization on this thing. Obviously, this is my black Dubsta, so it's completely murdered out, but you can do even more crazy stuff to these things, which is pretty cool. Now, the Dubsta is also very, very quick in a straight line, I must say. You're probably not going to win any races with this thing still, but it does have really good handling and pretty good acceleration, and I want to say a pretty decent top speed as well. The Dubsta, in my opinion, is a pretty underappreciated car in Grand Theft Auto Online, and I would really like to see an updated version of the Dubsta come to Grand Theft Auto Online at some point in the future. Who knows if it will, but I hope so. Overall, the Dubsta is definitely a car that I feel like a lot of people overlook, but it really is a fantastic vehicle, and I think that everybody should at least own a single Dubsta. Unfortunately, this vehicle is not purchasable. You have to steal it off of the street, but that's not the end of the world because that does mean that you get it for free. So there you have it. That is pretty much it for the Dubsta and the start of B tier. Next up in B tier, we have the Benefactor Panto. Now, the Panto goes for $85,000 in GTA, which is actually a pretty fair price considering this thing's performance. The performance of the Panto is actually very, very good. Now, you're not going to win any races in free mode against many other cars with this thing, but in the compacts category, the Panto is one of the faster vehicles in the entire category. You're probably not going to win in the compacts category anyways because the BF Club is in there, and that thing is literally on pace with most sports cars, so the Panto is still not going to fare very well, but it is still one of the fastest compacts in the entire game. On top of all of that, it also has very, very good customization. The handling is pretty nice. Acceleration is pretty nice as well. Top speed, obviously it's going to struggle a little bit. It is a smart car, so not the greatest ever. But for $85,000, you really cannot go wrong with at least owning a Panto. This thing is absolutely awesome. For the next vehicle within B tier, we have the Benefactor Glendale. Now, the Benefactor Glendale is actually one of the faster sedans in Grand Theft Auto Online, believe it or not. This is actually a very fun car to drive. It has really good handling and it has pretty decent acceleration as well. On top of that, the Glendale also has some pretty good customization options. Obviously, this thing is pretty bare bones, as you guys can see, but trust me, there are some pretty cool things that you can do to this thing. The Glendale goes for $200,000, which is a pretty fair price considering the performance of this vehicle and also the good looks. In my opinion, at least, it's a very good looking vehicle. The Glendale is pretty cool. It's pretty iconic. It's a classic old Mercedes. I think that the Glendale is a pretty awesome addition to Grand Theft Auto Online, and I'm definitely glad that we have this thing in here. Next up, we have the Benefactor Glendale. Custom, that is. Yeah, the Glendale Custom is basically, well, it's the Glendale, so it's $200,000 plus whatever the Benny's upgrade costs. I'm not honestly sure what it costs. I want to say it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000. I could be wrong, I could be high, I could be low. I'm not 100% sure. But what I do know is that the Glendale Custom basically takes the Glendale and makes it better in every single way. The acceleration is better, the handling is better. The customization options are obviously pretty crazy because you have to upgrade this thing in Benny's, so there's tons of stuff that you can do to this vehicle. On top of that, it also makes a pretty good drift car, which is maybe a bit odd, but a Glendale drift car is not the worst thing ever, I don't think. Overall, the Glendale Custom is just absolutely sick. I love the customization that you can do to this thing. The Glendale Custom is definitely the Glendale to have because you can basically keep it looking exactly like a regular Glendale, but just do a little more to it and get some better performance out of it. Let's move on to the final vehicle within B tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Schwarzer. Now this thing comes in at only $80,000, so it is of course thievable off of the street. Now the Benefactor Schwarzer is at the very top of B tier because I feel like this car for $80,000 is one of the best Benefactor cars you can get as far as bang for your buck goes. This thing has tons and tons of customization. It's also got some pretty good performance to back all of the customization up as well. It has great handling, really good acceleration for the price, and an okay top speed. I do think that this is one of the better looking Benefactor vehicles as well. I am a bit personally biased. I really do just love the Schwarzer, but it really is a great car. The Schwarzer is definitely one of the vehicles that I recommend new players to pick up because it is of course a free car, and for it being free, it is a great performing vehicle. The Schwarzer is definitely one that I think everybody should own in Grand Theft Auto Online, very similar to the Benefactor Dubsta. This thing is just so sick. This is of course the last vehicle within B tier, so let's move on to A tier. Next up, to start off A tier, we have the Benefactor Shafter V12. Now remember what I said about the Shafter LWB? Well, the V12 is basically better in every single way except for maybe handling. The LWB does tend to have a little bit better handling because it is the long wheelbase version of it. Of course, that's what LWB stands for if you did not know. However, the V12 sounds better, kind of looks better because the wheels are just a little bit closer together in my opinion, has better performance in every single possible way, except for handling, maybe, like I said. But the Shafter V12 is just an awesome car. For $116,000, you get one of the highest top speed 4-door vehicles in the entire game, and you get a vehicle that is within the top 2 fastest sedans around a track in Grand Theft Auto Online. The Shafter V12 is also a very interesting vehicle because it is actually within 2 categories in GTA. It's one of the only vehicles within the entire game to do such a thing. This thing is within the sedans category and the sports category, which is pretty interesting. The LWB is as well, but I figured I would mention that when I mentioned the V12. The V12 is a lot of fun to drive around. It's got pretty good customization. Overall, for $116,000, you cannot go wrong with a Benefactor Shafter V12. So that's pretty much it to start off A tier. Let's move on to the next vehicle. Next up in A tier, we have the Benefactor Shafter V12 Armored. Now, basically this is the exact same thing with the Shafter LWB. The V12 Armored is just better in pretty much every single way. It's actually a little bit slower than the regular V12, but of course this thing, like the LWB, can take 1 RPG and the car will be fine. You'll still be driving around, it will just be a little bit damaged. So it has a little bit extra survivability for free mode, but like I said, similar to the LWB, there are Oppressor Mark IIs flying around that carry 20 rockets and will absolutely extinguish the life of anybody who's driving something that's not a Night Shark or an Insurgent in Grand Theft Auto Online. So the extra ability to take 1 RPG does not really matter, but on the off chance that you're fighting a player who's on the ground with an RPG, you will be able to survive in the V12 Armored, whereas in the regular V12 you will not be able to survive. That's pretty much it for the Shafter V12 Armored. Let's move on to the next vehicle within A tier. The next vehicle we have in A tier is the Benefactor Dubsta 2. Now the Benefactor Dubsta 2 is actually a different vehicle than the Benefactor Dubsta 1. Obviously we saw the Benefactor Dubsta earlier, and of course the Benefactor Dubsta 2 is much higher on the list. Now, there are quite a few cosmetic things that are different with the Benefactor Dubsta 2 in comparison to the 1, but the main difference between the two of them is that the Dubsta 2 is a very rare vehicle. You can only get this thing very rarely from Los Santos Customs in 2 locations on the map. Now I have 2 full guides on how to get yourself a Dubsta 2, and I also have a video going over the differences between the Dubsta 1 and the Dubsta 2 if you guys are interested in trying to get one of these for yourself, or just knowing the difference between the 2 of them. Now, the Dubsta 2 has identical performance to the Benefactor Dubsta 1, however it does have quite a few cosmetic things that are different that I myself quite prefer on the Dubsta 2 versus the Dubsta 1. Overall, both Dubstas are fantastic vehicles and definitely should be owned by every player in Grand Theft Auto Online, considering they are both free to get, although the Dubsta 2 is a little bit harder to get than the Dubsta 1. That's it for the Dubsta 2, on to the next vehicle within A tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor XLS. Now this is a really underappreciated SUV within Grand Theft Auto Online, and I do really feel like it deserves to be an A tier because of how underappreciated it really is. Now it's not within the top 10 fastest SUVs in the game, so you're probably not going to win any races with this thing, but as a free mode vehicle for cruising, the XLS is one of the best in my opinion. Now this thing goes for $253,000, so it is a little bit on the expensive side. However, compared to most vehicles in Grand Theft Auto Online, it's really just a drop in the bucket. The XLS has really good handling, really good acceleration, and an okay top speed. Not the best ever. The XLS doesn't really have any remarkable features other than that it's just a really rare vehicle to see in online these days. That's pretty much it for the Benefactor XLS, guys. Let's move on to the next vehicle within A tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Xls Armored. Now, there is of course an armored version of the XLS. Benefactor seems to have quite a few of these Armored Edition vehicles, which I'm not complaining about. Now, the XLS Armored is virtually identical to the Benefactor XLS. However, the XLS Armored, in my opinion, has a much better suspension setup. As you guys can see, we're off-roading right now, but this thing is absolutely soaking up the bumps, and we're having a pretty smooth ride here. On top of that, the XLS Armored, of course, acts the exact same way that the Shafter V12 Armored and the Shafter Lwb Armored function, where it can take 1 RPG and keep driving, but after 2, it is of course eliminated. It also has the same bullet-resistant windows that the Shafter V12 and the Shafter Lwb Armored have. Now, this thing does come at a pretty huge cost, and that is of course $522,000, which is kind of an extreme amount of money considering the armor protection that this thing provides. It's not the worst vehicle ever, but it probably could be a little bit better. However, it will protect you, and I do think that it is a really good SUV. That is pretty much it for the Benefactor XLS, guys. Let's move on to the final vehicle of A tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Turreted Limo. Now, Benefactor really does have some pretty unique vehicles. Of course, the Turreted Limo is one of them. Now, the Turreted Limo, I have to say, actually has surprisingly good performance for it being a literal limousine. This thing has very good handling, and it actually has pretty decent acceleration once you get going. Now, off the line, this thing is not very good at all, but like I said, once you get moving, this thing, well, it also gets moving. It's pretty impressive. Now, unfortunately, the Turreted Limo does not have the greatest armor on Earth. However, it does of course have the minigun on the roof, which will sort of allow you to defend the vehicle against most threats. This thing is of course a 4-seater as well, so you can have a few of your boys in here with you, and it's a pretty good time. And if you were wondering how good the minigun is, well, I will show you. It can pretty much shred through any vehicle that comes at it. Even armored vehicles don't really stand up to this thing very well at all, so you can do some heavy damage with this thing. Like I said, the armor is not very great, but it doesn't really matter because, well, it's got a minigun on it, so like, who really cares? Now, unfortunately, the Turreted Limo is a Pegasus vehicle, or you can spawn it from the CEO Vehicles tab in the SecuroServe CEO tab in the interaction menu. So there's not really many ways to get this thing, just Pegasus and, unfortunately, the interaction menu. I really wish that this thing was capable of being a personal vehicle somehow, but of course I understand why it's not. Now, the Turreted Limo does come at a pretty significant cost, which is $1,650,000, so it is on the expensive side of things. And it's good, but it's not that good. It's not S tier good. So that's why it's at the top of A tier instead. That is it for A tier. Let's move on to S tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Bruiser, which I honestly didn't really know existed until today, and so I know I might be sleeping under a rock. When I was researching the vehicles to do this video, I found this thing and I was like, what on earth is this? So it is my understanding that this is a modified Benefactor Glendale. Of course, you modify it within the Arena Workshop. Now, this vehicle is, well, a bit unique, you could say. Now, it has this big boom on the front of it, which you can use to slam vehicles out of your way. It effectively is like the Phantom Wedge, but just a little bit less effective. On top of that, it also has a rocket boost, this vehicle, which is pretty insane, so you can get this thing really moving, so you can launch Futos up in the air like I just did to that one. Now, on top of the rocket boost, it also has a jump boost, which is pretty insane. I really wish that I had got one of these sooner because this thing is an absolute blast. It is also equipable with proximity mines, which you can see I'm dropping there behind me, and of course it also has a minigun on the front of it. Actually, sorry, dual 50 cal machine guns on the front of it. I made a mistake there. These things are highly effective at neutralizing civilians or any targets that you're fighting, really. Obviously we don't shoot civilians, that is just not right. But if you ever had to, this thing makes pretty quick work of, well, pretty much anything that you throw at it. So there you have it. Obviously, this thing is also pretty highly customizable. Everything that you see on this thing is something that I decided to put on it. So there's lots and lots of things that you can do to this vehicle. Definitely a very interesting vehicle. Anyway guys, that is pretty much it for the Benefactor Bruiser. Let's move on to the next vehicle within S tier. Next up, we have what is arguably the best sounding car in all of Grand Theft Auto Online, and that is of course the Benefactor Sterling Gt. This thing is obviously based off of an old Mercedes 300 SL, which is pretty darn cool. Now this car actually has some pretty good customization, and it's also a pretty decent performer. This is one of the cars that is within the top 10 fastest sports classic cars in the entire game. It is also one of very few cars in the game that has gull wing doors, and all of this only costs $975,000, which is honestly a pretty bargain price considering just how good this vehicle is. Overall, the Sterling GT is one of the best sounding cars in the game, which is the main reason that I love this thing so much, but it also has great handling, great acceleration, pretty good top speed. There's really nothing to complain about with this thing. The only thing that it could do is just, well, be faster, but that's pretty much it for the Sterling GT. Let's move on to the next vehicle in S tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Feltzer. Now the Feltzer is an OG car in Grand Theft Auto Online. This thing came out with the game all the way back in 2013. And the most impressive thing to me about the Feltzer is how good this thing performs even to this day. The Feltzer is in 12th or 13th place currently in the standings as far as tracks and lap times go in Grand Theft Auto Online within the sports car category. Pretty impressive considering this car has been out since the game has been out. The Feltzer has tons and tons of customization options as well, although by today's standards it's not that many, but for what it was back in 2013, the Feltzer was definitely one of the most customizable cars. Now the Feltzer only costs $145,000, so just being outside of the top 10 within the sports car category around a track is pretty damn impressive to me. The Feltzer is definitely an underappreciated and underrated car in Grand Theft Auto Online these days, and I really wish that more people would drive this thing and would appreciate it. At its price point, it is definitely the best bang for your buck performer on this entire list. Let's move on to the next vehicle within S tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Dubsta 6x6. Now, you'd be surprised the amount of people that don't know that the Benefactor Dubsta 6x6 actually exists in Grand Theft Auto Online. And another pretty unbelievable part about this thing is that when it first came out, $250,000 was a lot of money, which is the price of this thing. It actually goes for $249,000 and it is available on Warstock Cash and Carry. The 6x6 is one of my favorite vehicles in the entire game and is definitely one that the community really underappreciates. This thing is a fantastic performing vehicle. It's very quick in a straight line, and it truly is 6-wheel drive if you guys were wondering. Now there's a lot of people in the community who claim that this thing is actually only 4-wheel drive driven by the 4 rear wheels, but I can confirm I have tested it. I have seen the front wheels spinning on this thing as well, so there you have it. The 6x6 is a pretty great off-roader. The only thing that I have a complaint with this vehicle is that for some reason the tires are really slippery. I'm not sure what has made them this way, but they do tend to lack some grip, especially when you're ascending a mountain. But it is of course 6-wheel drive, so usually it's not really a problem. The 6x6 for $250,000 is one of the best and most fun vehicles you can get in the entire game. Now it doesn't have a whole lot of customization that you can do to it, but it doesn't really matter because it's just such a sick vehicle. The 6x6 is definitely one that I recommend picking up, probably more than most of the other vehicles on this list. For $250,000, you cannot go wrong with the 6x6. You will have an absolute blast with this thing. On to the next vehicle in S tier. Next up, we have the Benefactor Terabyte. Yes, this thing is a Benefactor, so it's getting ranked. The best ability within the Terabyte is of course to be able to modify the Oppressor Mark II, so what you do is you hop on it here, you go down to sell, and then you do that. It's really good. It's probably the best thing you can do with the Terabyte. Now of course on top of that there is a weapon workshop within the Terabyte, so you can upgrade weapons to the Mark II versions, which is always nice to be able to have. Of course, another great feature about the Terabyte is it does have this big touchscreen, which you can access here, and it allows you to launch several missions from it. Overall, the Terabyte is pretty useful for that sort of stuff. Now, the Terabyte is not exactly a fast vehicle, which I know that nobody well, should or would expect this thing to be a very quick vehicle, so there you have it. But an interesting feature about the Terabyte is it is the second most armored vehicle in all of Grand Theft Auto Online. This thing can take somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 homing missiles from an Oppressor Mark II. Overall, the Terabyte is a pretty useful vehicle, hence it being in S tier. That's pretty much it for the Terabyte though. Let's move on to the next vehicle. Next up, we have the Benefactor Schlagen Gt coming in at $1.3 million. Now, 1.3 mil is a little bit steep, however, this thing is a really good sports car, and it has tons and tons of customization. It's also one of the better sounding vehicles in the entire game, and it's a super fun vehicle to drive around in free mode. This thing is super easy to double clutch as well, which is definitely a very nice feature to have because it allows you to drift this thing super easily, and you can do donuts in this thing easier than most vehicles in Grand Theft Auto Online. On top of that, it's also one of the most realistic looking cars in all of Grand Theft Auto Online in my opinion, obviously being based off of the AMG GT or the AMG GTS or the AMG GTR in real life. The Schlagen GT for $1.3 million is a very good car. Now, you're probably not going to win any sports car races with this thing, however, that's not what it's all about, and it still is a very good performing vehicle. That's pretty much it for the Schlagen GT. Let's move on to the next vehicle. Next up, we have the Benefactor Krieger. Now, the Krieger is on the expensive side of things. This thing goes for almost $3 million in Grand Theft Auto Online, which is a lot of money. However, for that price, you do get the literal best supercar in Grand Theft Auto Online at the time of recording this video, of course. And also not counting the HSW vehicles on the expanded and enhanced edition of Grand Theft Auto Online. The Krieger has fantastic handling, great acceleration, and a pretty competitive top speed. It's also got some really good customization options, so you can make this thing super unique and very much your own. The Krieger is one of my favorite cars to race with within the supercars category. It definitely has pretty much the best handling out of the top couple of supercars in the entire game, so the Krieger is a very good car in my books. Now, it does come at a cost, of course, but performance also does come at a cost, so you can't really argue that it shouldn't be the price that it does cost because it is just that good of a car. The Krieger is definitely a car that you guys are going to want if you plan on doing supercar races at any point in Grand Theft Auto Online. That is pretty much it for the Benefactor Krieger. Let's move on to the #1 vehicle that Benefactor produces in Grand Theft Auto Online. Of course, at #1 we have the Benefactor Br8. Now, this is also one of the most expensive vehicles on this entire list. Outside of the Terabyte, this is the most expensive vehicle on this list. It does come at a cost, but also the performance of this thing outshines any other land vehicle that Benefactor produces and any other land vehicle in Grand Theft Auto Online. The Benefactor Br8 has extreme amounts of downforce and it has a crazy amount of upgrades. There's so much with the Benefactor Br8, it is very hard to delve into, especially in a video like this where I'm just briefly touching on most of the vehicles. However, if you throw the Benefactor Br8 at any circuit in Grand Theft Auto Online, as long as the circuit has corners, the Benefactor Br8 will be the fastest vehicle and the most consistently fast vehicle around said circuit. If it's a straightaway only thing, then there are better vehicles than the Br8, but if it has corners, the Br8 is probably going to destroy everything else because this thing is absolutely insane when it comes to cornering. It's also got a pretty good amount of customization, but it does come at a huge cost, and the cost of this thing is $3,400,000, which, yes, I know that is very expensive. I believe this is actually one of the most expensive unweaponized land vehicles in the entire game, so that is pretty crazy. Obviously, performance, like I said, does come at a cost, and the Br8 is the performer. It is the best performer. It's undeniable how good this thing is. As you guys can see, literally I can go around pretty much any corner as fast as I want to, and the Br8 is going to stick to the ground. Obviously, I kind of messed that up right there, but I think you guys get the point. The Br8 is fantastic in every single way. The Br8 is definitely a vehicle that I would recommend picking up if you are a pretty advanced player in GTA. If you got a lot of extra money to throw around, this thing is definitely something that you should look into. Anyway guys, that is it for S tier, and not only for S tier, but that is it for our Benefactor tier list. If you guys enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments down below. Leave a like as well if you don't mind. It is definitely very appreciated. Dislike if you didn't enjoy the video, of course. Subscribe if you guys are new. Let me know in the comments down below what tier list for a vehicle manufacturer you guys want to see next, and I will see you all in the next video. Until then, take care. Peace.